My name is Heidi Urben. I teach at Georgetown University, and I'm honored to moderate today's panel, which is devoted to modern war at home. And I'm just not sure there's enough to talk about the home front over the next hour and a half. We'll do our best. We might need some audience participation here, but luckily I'm joined by three superb colleagues who have wonderful thoughts on this complicated topic. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them first, then I'll provide some overarching stage setter framing questions, and then we'll have a chance to hear from all of them. I'll then ask a few questions of them, but we'll spend plenty of time to hear from the audience. First off, Dr. Carrie Lee, lead organizer of this wonderful conference, is an associate professor here at the Army War College, where she serves as both chair of the Department of National Security and Strategy and director of the Center on Civil Military Relations. Once you do one conference, it becomes a beloved tradition. This is now a beloved tradition that we're happy to say it's in its second iteration. Carrie has written widely on civil military relations and is the co-editor of a forthcoming book on the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force. She holds a PhD from Stanford. Mr. Bishop Garrison is a senior national security executive who currently works in private industry on responsible and ethical use of AI. Before that, he served as the senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Human Capital and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. A graduate of West Point and a former Army officer, Bishop holds a law degree from William & Mary, and I'm proud to call him a colleague, as Bishop is one of our exceptional adjunct faculty members at Georgetown. Lastly, Dr. Lindsay Cohn is an associate professor at the Naval War College, where she researches domestic policing and militarization, personnel and recruiting, public opinion, and democratic norms and governance. She is working on a highly anticipated book on the civil military relations of domestic use of federal force for policing in the United States. And I commend to you the article she co-authored with Dr. Jessica Blankshane and Dr. Danny Lupton, available now in American Political Science Review, aptly titled, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Public Perceptions of Coercive State Power." Lindsay holds a PhD from Duke University. As I mentioned, I'm honored to moderate this final panel of the day, devoted to modern war at home. And I really appreciate the framing of that title. Home represents a critical component of civil military relations. It's how society connects with its military and how the military in turn is shaped by society. In the most basic terms, if there's an issue or a problem in society, we should expect to see it also in the military. For example, if society is polarized, we should expect to see that in those attitudes within the ranks. If there are elements in society prone to extremism, we should expect to see that to some degree, even if it's very small, in the military. The list goes on. Obesity, sexual assault, mental health crisis, as our earlier panel talked about today. If it exists in society, it exists in the all-volunteer force. But the story doesn't simply end there, that the military is a reflection of society. The military is and claims to be a profession. Professions are marked by certain expertise and professional standards and professional ethics. Professions that are characterized by strong norms and standards do not tolerate violations of their professional ethic. So from this, there's no shortage of questions for our panel devoted to modern war at home, a few that we will try to wrestle with today. How well is today's military postured to address and blunt some of the major societal challenges today? Politicization of the military, and challenges to the military's norm of nonpartisanship, for example. What is the extent of extremism in the military today? And what are the challenges associated with even defining it and accounting for it? Do the military services and the Department of Defense bear responsibility for radicalization of veterans after they leave the service? If so, how? What will public confidence in the military look like over the next decade? And what are the implications associated with a plateauing of confidence? There's an up-and-coming scholar who's written a new book on public confidence that you all should give a look to. Peter Fever's Thanks for Your Service. He's going places, gang. He's going places. The tagline for his book is that confidence in the post-9/11 era was high but hollow. What can we expect it to look like in the coming years, and does it matter? Does it matter if the American public knows very little about its military and the professional norms that underpin it? Conversely, what are the consequences of a public that knows what the major civil military norms are, but is willing to discard them if they don't align with their partisan preferences? What's the future of the National Guard, the part of the military that is closest to home? What are the missions it should expect to fulfill? In a deeply polarized society, will the use of the Guard to quell protests become more frequent? What does the public think about that? Luckily, we have somebody on this panel who's given a lot of thought and attention to that. Lastly, what are the challenges today associated with connecting home with its military and vice versa? We have a declining percentage of veterans in society. I think the current statistic is veterans constitute about 6% of society. In the post-9/11 era, public attitudes towards the military were often characterized as the public looks at the military with equal parts ignorance and reverence. If we look at millennial attitudes and Gen Z attitudes, that might be more ignorance and skepticism than ignorance and reverence. So what are the impediments and the opportunities associated with today's information environment in connecting the military with society? And how do all of these factors shape ongoing recruitment and retention issues? I'll pause there with that framing and turn things over first to Dr. Carrie Lee for some opening comments. We'll go down the line and then get a chance to hear from you. Carrie.
So one of the privileges of organizing a conference like this is you get to put yourself on the panel that you want to talk about things. And this is the product of, this is not the only conference that has been held on civil military relations over the last couple of years. There was a flurry of them last year with the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force. And so much of what I want to talk about was actually first generated as a kind of seed at the first conference to kick that season off that was sponsored by Colonel Reed, who moderated the earlier panel today on the all-volunteer force. And he put me on a panel about the future of war, and I didn't totally understand why at the time, but it has gotten me thinking about what does the future of war look like, and how does that then impact the domestic political environment, because most of my work thinks about kind of domestic politics and foreign policy. And the tagline here, and what occurred to me, is that if the Defense Department does its job right, that is, if we get strategy right, then deterrence with China will hold. And the wars that the United States will be fighting will be preponderantly small wars, asymmetric wars, wars in places that we really didn't foresee. It won't be the cataclysmic peer-to-peer competition or peer-to-peer conflict that the Defense Department is so worried about and which we're rightly preparing for. But the future of war will look something closer to what the Cold War looked like, with proxy wars, asymmetric conflicts, and more Vietnams than the Fulda Gap or the Taiwan Straits. And so what does that mean when we're thinking about public opinion at home, and what does that mean when we're thinking about domestic politics at home? Well, it means that the types of wars that we're going to be fighting are much harder to win in the public space. So another opportunity that I had, I don't see Kate Kuzminski. She may have had to leave. Sorry, Kate, I'm calling you out. But she co-sponsored at Center for New American Security a really interesting tabletop exercise talking about the draft and thinking through, mobilization for a draft in the event of a conflict with China. And the conclusion, you should all go read her report, right, when it comes out and it's forthcoming. But much of the consensus across several of us in this group was that public opinion and public support for a war with China, particularly when you're dealing with an acute threat, is not going to be the issue that it is something to think about. But again, in the face of an acute threat, that's not where you're worried. You're worried about manpower, you're worried about technology, you're worried about sustainment and protracted war. But those kind of immediate should you or should you not questions in the scenarios that we were presented, at least, was not the challenge. Instead, though, what happens if you look at, do you go into another Vietnam? Do you go into another Afghanistan, particularly in the wake of 20 years of war and a public where the term forever war has become commonplace. And there's not a lot of public appetite for these types of conflicts anymore. And what I want to focus some comments on is that this produces an information environment that is particularly susceptible to foreign influence, that is particularly susceptible to politicization and partisan infighting and partisan discord, and could be particularly problematic as we're thinking about trying to sustain long-term policy or long-term conflicts the way that these kind of asymmetric conflicts can turn out to be and often do turn out to be. This leads to a certain set of strategies that make it actually harder to win wars. So when my own research looks at the temptation to alter military strategy in anticipation of what public opinion is going to be or how a public is going to react, particularly in the lead up to elections and other kind of moments of domestic political importance. These strategies vary depending on whether you're fighting asymmetric wars or whether you're fighting conventional wars. They vary depending on whether you can show measures of progress on a battlefield, a la moving the battlefield lines in Ukraine, versus winning hearts and minds in a counterinsurgency campaign, or how many terrorists did you kill in a counterterrorism campaign. And so this is going to lead to a different set of military strategies. It leads to a very different set of political calculus that makes it harder to win wars outright and dedicate the kinds of resources necessary in order to win the nation's wars. And so I think what I would open with is that as we think about what the future of war looks like, and again, if the Department of Defense does strategy correctly and we do not end up in a hot conflict, God forbid, with the People's Republic of China, then you're looking at a future of very contested asymmetric conflicts where the information environment at home and the political environment at home is going to matter enormously when it comes to strategy and success in those conflicts. The second thing that I want to turn to and that I want to talk a little bit about is this is actually a really good time for me to say that nothing that I'm saying up on this stage represents the official policy or attitude of the Department of Defense, the Army War College, or anyone I have worked for in the future or might have worked for in the past or might work for in the future. These are all just kind of my thoughts. So with that caveat, those are enemies foreign. We are in a political environment now where a crisis of legitimacy of government institutions has led to a disturbing rise in political violence inside the United States and a disturbing tolerance for political violence inside the United States that undercuts official and government coercive mechanisms. Obviously, the elephant in the room is January 6th, but you see this in plots to kidnap governors, you see this in assassination attempts, you see this in a rise in political violence that we haven't really seen since, I would argue, the 1960s. I think this matters when it comes to how we are conceiving the nature of national defense and what is worth, where kind of strategies are worth investing in and protecting. It is not to say, and Lindsay is the colleague who should answer all of the questions on this, but what I am increasingly thinking about is the degree to which veterans play a role in this movement, or the degree to which military imagery is co-opted as a part of this movement, and in an effort to legitimize it, and an effort to kind of co-opt the prestige of the military, the enduring prestige of the military, particularly in relation to other government institutions. And how much does that draw the military into this conflict, into this domestic political conflict that erupts in violence occasionally and extrajudicial violence? And this is a very real threat to the legitimacy of government across the United States. It's a very real threat to United States democracy and its ability to project power, both enforce its laws and the rule of law domestically, but also then project power abroad and project influence abroad as the Biden administration continues to really emphasize the discrepancies between democracy and autocracy and rule of law versus rule by law. These are very important distinctions that we like to think of ourselves as a shining city on a hill, but similar to my conversation with Ambassador Lute this morning, we have homework to do as well. And the degree to which the military is being pulled into this conflict through the use of military imagery and the prominence of reporting on veterans as a part of this movement is deeply concerning. So I will leave my comments there.
Thanks, Carrie.
And I'm going to defer everything about veterans to Bishop. So,
So just be a cycle.
Well, luckily, we're going to answer every possible question ever about this topic here right now. Mark your calendars, 3:50, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We did it, guys. We did it. Bishop Garrison, again, I am absolutely honored to be with this esteemed panel. The way I want to start my comments on this is just briefly. First, this is, in my mind, a large pillar of it is about institutional trust. That's kind of the direction I'm coming from this. So as a disclaimer, when we were beginning this, also as a part of my duties in the Secretary's front office, Secretary Austin, I was responsible for leading and establishing the Countering Extremist Activity Working Group, CAWG, within the department. And our focus was to try to determine the nature of this problem and provide recommendations for it. I'll start there and say that disclaimer is that, and I continue to believe this, the nature of this issue, whenever you talk about politicalization, it always is going to come back to some degree to extremist activity or behavior. Those actions are taken by a very, very, very small group of individuals that are associated with the department, whether they be active duty, reserve, National Guard, and veterans or civilians. It's a very small group that can have a detrimental and very large outsized impact with their activities. But the vast, vast, vast majority of those who serve both in uniform and as civilians do so with great honor and integrity throughout their careers with the department. That's first how I set this up. When we talk about the nature of this issue, and I believe Carrie kind of hit the nail on the head a little bit here, the other half to that is, so what is the nature of the issue? Well, we don't know. Because we have not gone deeply enough into the data to understand, or even collected the data, even properly tagged the data in systems to know what the actual nature of this issue is. That goes back to the institutional trust issue. If we are going to tell society, the civilians that govern us as an organization, as a culture, as a community, we need to be able to tell them what the nature of this issue is. And at the end of the day, right now as it stands, we don't fully know. We don't fully know. Well, why don't we know? Why aren't we collecting this data? Because it has been a politicized issue. As some of my colleagues here know, and I'm not going to go deeply in this because I don't want to just keep beating a drum about it. As a part of our work with the working group, I was personally attacked. My character was brought into question based off of faint zero evidence of any wrongdoing, as were the actions of then Chairman Milley, of Secretary Austin, of so many people by actors within the political sphere who look to utilize this type of issue to leverage to their own political gain and to distract from other issues that were ancillary, had nothing to do with the military or anything else that might have been going on with them personally or with their groups at that time. That is a part of the problem here. It creates an issue in which you're politicizing something that objectively we should all have a vested interest in engaging on and ensuring that we understand the full nature of the issue. When you politicize it in that way, it becomes radioactive and no one wants to go near it or touch it, or at least becomes a problem that it is not and it shouldn't be. So that's a part of this ongoing thing. And again, that erodes the trust that we have between society, between Congress in general, and with our international partners, because they see this as another form of internal dysfunction within the United States. So how can they trust us to know and understand the issues that we're giving them counsel and giving them support on when they look at us and say, you can't handle the things going on in your own house? So that's another part of this as well. So when we talk about politicalization, it's important to understand that inherently parts of what military leadership is political. The issue is it is not partisan. And that is, I think, where the misnomer really gets to it. I think for generations, and even, is one of the golden children, 2002 of West Point class, if you folks remember, bicentennial class, beat Navy. We were often, as a refrain, taught that, you don't want to be political, you don't want to engage in any of these types of political things. Well, to be political in the military is an important thing, to understand the civics behind it, to understand the engagement of it. But being political is okay and it is healthy. It is when you act as a partisan actor on these issues, that is where it becomes much more problematic. Now, that doesn't mean that you may not hold your own beliefs that have partisan leanings. Of course, you're responsible for that, and it is important that we as productive adults within our society engage in our beliefs and do what we can to be thoughtful leaders as we do this, and being active in civics is a part of that. But when you bring that into the overall objective actions, when you bring that into the way that you may lead individuals, that's what becomes problematic. Now, what does it mean? And I know these are thin lines that we're talking about here, and this is why this tends to be such a sticky topic. What does it mean when we say that we are going to be political? Well, look, and for better or worse, all of our flag officers continue to require votes from the Hill, from the Senate. They're confirmed. Even the list of officers, commissioned officers, your lists go before Congress and they're reviewed. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of that isn't just often a red rubber stamp and they move forward. But the fact of the matter is, the higher you go in the ranks, the more you're going to engage on political issues. And I personally think that's important because politics play into policy. They absolutely do. And what is happening in the political sphere is going to affect everything from budget requests to deployments to support for military families and veteran services, all of it. So it is not a strategically smart idea for us to run away from the idea of politics and say we're just going to be apolitical. You can't be. What we want to be is nonpartisan. What we want to do is ensure that we are focused in the way that we are engaging in the political sphere, because the former, to be partisan, is corrosive and detrimental to the overall esprit de corps of the military. The latter is a necessary pillar of a modern society. And so I think I've covered the majority of this. Now, and this goes back to another point that Carrie was making in terms of recruitment and retention. We see that we have a little bit of a recruitment gap right now, to say the least, with military services. And a part of that tends to be the dialogue that is happening in society. And a part of that goes to a knowledge gap between the military and between society, as well as how the military and its actions play out in things like the media, whether it be what's happening amplified on social media, whether that is what is happening in the news and how that is being amplified as well. And then when you look at this warrior class that we continue to see, where less than 1% of the total population in the United States has served in the military at any time, you get back to some of these issues. Well, 6%, 6 to 7% right now are veterans, and that number is going to continue to decline. You have an entire generation now who are reaching the age of 21, 22, 23, 21, who were children throughout post 9/11. And they're going to have very specific ideas of what it means to serve their country in these capacities. And it is not going to always be with the same type of esteem that we have seen in previous generations. And at the same time, those are a lot of the individuals we need, their skill sets, their technical expertise and prowess, their understanding of culture and everything that's happening around the world. These are some of the most interconnected people that we have ever had in any generation. Their talents are important for us to close this gap and to ensure that we remain competitive globally and continue to be the global leaders that we are as we continue to talk about strategic competitiveness with China, with Russia, and all of the complexities and issues that we're continuing to engage on at any given day. We need them. And we need them to understand what military service is and what it is all about. But when it comes back to all of this at the top, it's about institutional trust. And if they don't trust in what our military is, the values that we stand for, when we notice or see or identify issues that we're going to aggressively engage them and try to do something to protect against them, they're not going to trust us. And we're going to continue to have this corrosive gap that is going to hurt our readiness and is already taken place. And there's no one answer to how we go back and engage them. There is no one idea as to what's going to help us close these gaps, what's going to bring it about. But the societal dialogue around all of these issues, around politicalization of the military, around what we do with the extremist activity, around what we've done previously with sexual assault, sexual harassment, with all of these hot button sticky issues is going to determine how we're able to address a lot of our issues and concerns and our ability to project power and to be diplomatic leaders from now into the future.
Thanks, Bishop. Lindsay.
Great. Well, I also want to thank Carrie for putting this together and Heidi for moderating this. I am just going to make a couple of points here, building off of a few things that have been said here and in earlier panels. The first one is building off of something that both Heidi and Carrie mentioned, which is the fact that we are in a political situation in this country right now where there is significant dissensus societally on what we are as a country, on who we are as a country, on who belongs, who has a voice, and who doesn't. And the military cannot escape these problems. The military cannot insulate itself and you know, as Bishop implied, cannot sort of stick its fingers in its ears and say, la, 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 we're not political, we don't have to deal with any of this. So a few, and to Carrie's point about, you know, the probable nature of the wars we'll be fighting, I think that this would be true no matter what kind of war we're fighting. Adversaries will try to exploit domestic division. I mean, I would, it just makes sense, right? So recalling Meredith Claycamp's comments on the need to increase racial and ethnic diversity in the military while dealing with the fact that the traditional recruit bases are generally opposed to that, and dealing with the fact that military culture remains a very path-dependent thing, sort of stuck on, like, as many people have pointed out today, we do this because this is what we do. Many of those "this is what we do" things were instituted in the late 1940s and 1950s and are just kind of still there because that's how that worked then for those people. It's hard to change organizational culture, I get that, but it needs to be done if you're going to get the people that you need with the skills that you need. But that becomes a partisan issue, right? It becomes an issue of, well, then you're not being meritocratic. We can talk about that if we want to. Issues of readiness, good order and discipline, being coded as partisan, you know. We were having a conversation earlier about vaccines, right? I mean, back in the 1980s and 1990s, the anthrax vaccine was extremely controversial, but it wasn't partisan. The controversy was not partisan. The controversy was, this has really horrible side effects and I really don't want to take it. But now vaccination is a partisan issue. I mean, there are seriously states rolling back polio vaccine requirements. Not because there's, anyway, you know what I'm saying. And then, you know, issues of legitimacy of governance and the role, you know, as both Heidi and Carrie mentioned, the role that the armed forces may be called on to play in political violence, and particularly with respect to possible electoral violence. These are the kinds of things that the military is going to have to grapple with, and I do not personally think they're well postured to grapple with these things. I think the thing to keep in mind for us thinking about this issue of political, particularly in a democratic environment, is that there is a tension at the center of the concept of democracy, which is do we consider democracy a legitimate form of government because the process is legitimate and like what the people want the people should get? Or do we consider it legitimate because it's the most likely thing to produce certain types of outcomes, like human rights and civil rights and minority rights and things like that? There is no democratic society in the world that embodies either of those extremes. They all have some kind of mix. The problem for the military is that they have no objective way of determining when they should defend the process and when they should defend the outcomes. And that puts them in a position where they have some really serious difficulties when they are tasked with doing something that they're not entirely sure is right or legal or legitimate. And I would point out, you know, another issue for militaries being tasked to do things at home, especially the federal military in this case, but the National Guard as well, is that they've been trained on the laws of armed conflict. They've been trained in international humanitarian law. They understand necessity and proportionality. If they're working at home, they are not working under the laws of war. They're working under domestic law. And most of them have absolutely no idea what would count as an illegal order under those circumstances. I don't know that anyone knows what would count as an illegal order under those circumstances. So issues that they would need to deal with. So how does the military deal with these issues, right? They can try and avoid talking about anything political, right? The approach that Bishop described, it's totally understandable that many military people take. But as Risa has pointed out, silence is also a statement. They can try to become more sophisticated about how they deal with and speak about these issues, but that, as someone like Sam Sarkeesian would have advocated for in the 1970s and 1980s, but that, while I think is a good idea, it can exacerbate the potential problem of having the military officers be the solution to all the problems, right? Having them become the most sophisticated political analysts and communicators of everybody. And that, you know, if you study comparative civ mil, you know that that's just generally not a good idea. They can try to stake out specific positions and create a narrative that these positions are objectively necessary. They don't have any political or partisan reason for doing these things. This is just how our organization operates, and this is what we need to do to be effective. But I guarantee you that narrative will not convince a certain segment of the population. They will see that position as a partisan position because it's going to align in some ways with one side or another. And even if they have a position that aligns in some ways with one and in some ways the other, the public and the politicians are going to see that as opportunity to use them for partisan purposes. The military cannot, I don't think they can escape that. So I think, the bottom line for the military side of this, and I'll talk about the public in just a second, the bottom line for the military side of this, in my opinion, is that so long as we have significant societal dissensus on what kind of country we live in, what our political norms are, what is acceptable political behavior and what is not, who deserves a voice in the country, the military is going to suffer. They're going to suffer internally, they're going to suffer in terms of recruiting. And depending on who ends up with political power, they may either pursue essentially a program of stacking in the military, right? They may pursue prioritizing personal or party loyalty over competence in terms of officer selection. Or they could intentionally implement a program of diversity and inclusiveness along the lines of what Meredith was talking about as being necessary, sort of the way the Lebanese military did after their civil war. Or they could just keep trying to bail out the recruiting and retention carrier with a teacup, the way that they have been doing thus far. And Eric knows what I'm talking about. Where is he? He's back there. So I don't think, none of these are good options, right? I think we're in a very tough spot. But my bottom line point with all this is that we can't just focus on the military and say we can just fix these problems inside the military. These are societal problems. And while we absolutely need to look at ways to make the military work as well as possible, and we need to focus on doing the tweaks that we can do, we cannot simply try to fix the military and be like, okay, whew, that's done, right? I don't think that's going to work. Last little set of points. How does the public feel about all of these issues? We already heard that the public is becoming somewhat more accepting of political violence. We know that fewer and fewer people know someone who is in the military. Fewer and fewer people understand sort of what's involved. We know from research that not as many US Americans as we would like actually believe in the set of civil-military norms that everyone in this room, I think, takes for granted. We also have some new research that Danny and Jessica Blankchain and I have done, looking at how the US military feels specifically about deploying state coercive power against domestic civil unrest for various reasons, right? And so I would say the US, on the issue of confidence, right? The US public does still have high confidence in the military. It has recently declined somewhat. We heard that in the last panel. But it's important to recognize that the biggest decline in confidence has come from Republican identifying white men. They still have high levels of confidence overall, but the biggest decline in confidence has come from that group. And that is partly a result of some deliberate targeting of military words and actions by Republican figures. It has implications for recruiting, but it's just something that we need to keep in mind. That decline in confidence is not a sort of secular thing. It's happening differentially in different parts of the population. The confidence of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans is still fairly low in the military, has been for quite some time, still fairly low. The US public is not keen on the use of federal forces to deal with protests or response to other types of political activity. They don't, but that being said, so they don't like seeing the military sent in to deal with what they see as political behavior. On the other hand, people in general also don't like violence and disorder. So they want something to happen if they see something that they code as violence, but if they code it as political action, they don't tend to want to see a military response to it. The US public is more accepting of the National Guard as a responder to these kinds of things and more accepting of local police as a responder to these kinds of things. we're not entirely sure whether they're accepting of the National Guard because they have any understanding of the difference between the National Guard and the regular military, or because they like local responses better than federal responses. We're not 100% sure why we got that result. But we do know from both the social movement literature and the Civil War literature that when governments crack down, particularly using armed force, visibly armed force, particularly visibly militarized force, for example, wearing military-style uniforms, using military-style tactics, this usually backfires. It usually backfires in the sense of increasing both the spread of the activity and the level of violence of the activity. Right, so what I would put in here is we don't know for certain that using the military and or the National Guard to quell protests, for example, student protests, we don't know for sure that that would have an adverse effect on the public's confidence in the military overall. We don't know that, but the implication is that it might not be good. The implication is that given the fact that there are certain groups with declining trust in the institution already, that if they were used in ways that the public views as generally not very legitimate, that might be an even bigger problem. Again, we do not have data that guarantees that that's the outcome. It's possible that people, so there is some indication, and Neil is right there, there is some indication that sort of ex post, when you look back on it, if they did a good job and if they did it sort of neutrally, then people like the intervention, right? But we don't know that going in, and there's also no really necessarily good reason to expect that they would necessarily do a really nonviolent job, depending on the circumstances and what they were asked to do. I will stop there.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll ask a couple questions and then we'll invite the audience to come up and ask. And I'll start off with a real easy one, the upcoming election. Right, so 2020 saw unprecedented efforts to try to draw the military into the election. What should senior military leaders, including leaders in the National Guard, be thinking about? And what should they be doing as the election draws near? And I'll offer it up to anybody who wants to take a stab. You can't play hot potato.
Yeah,
I'm not going to let that happen.
On this. So I think the challenge to the active duty and the challenge to the National Guard are two very different things. And there are different problem sets to worry about, both of which are worth paying a lot of attention to. I was astonished in 2020 when General Milley began visiting different war colleges and different parts of the military enterprise to start speaking about and explicitly introduced in almost every speech he gave, we are loyal to the Constitution and not a person. That was unprecedented. It was, to my mind, as a war college professor down in Montgomery, Alabama, at the time I was working down at AIR, I heard that for the first time and I looked over at my colleague and I went, whoa, things must be much worse in Washington, D.C. than we thought they were, for the chairman to get up and say that. But I actually think that it was extraordinarily effective because it was a reminder of a core principle in the oath that military officers take to the Constitution, which, I mean, Lindsay, your point about process versus outcomes is extraordinary, and I'm going to have to do some really hard thinking about that as I think about kind of what it means to have a democratic ethos and think through, what it means to protect democracy.
My book will be out in a couple of months.
And so that's going to keep me, well, I already don't sleep, but that's going to keep me up at night. And but I think that was an extraordinarily effective tool to go out and remind the force and allow the public to see that in a way that he was there reminding the force that you have an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, which includes the process by which we elect our leaders. So that kind of elite signaling amongst the active duty, I think was effective, and yet stayed within the bounds. It was, to me, it wasn't subtle, but it was subtle enough, I think, on the public radar, that the message got across to the people who needed to hear it. On the National Guard side, boy, we see so much conflict today between the governors and the federal branch. And governors today have rediscovered the National Guard as an instrument for subverting federal authority. Again, in ways that we just haven't really seen since the 1950s and 1960s fights over segregation. And this kind of rediscovery, I would argue, is a canary in a coal mine about potential actions that may subvert democracy, that may subvert other things that we care about. So it's vaccinations in Oklahoma, which got resolved by the court system, but was sort of the initial test bed. And then it was debates over the abortion policy in the wake of the Dobbs decision and DOD's inclusion of abortion as medical procedure for which travel was reimbursed. And then now it is currently the border crisis down in Texas and the use of the National Guard and the State Guard as well, versus kind of border agents and federal border agents. And we don't know how that's going to get resolved in the legal system yet. So these are all kind of test beds for how far can the governors push their authority and their chain of command over the National Guard before, in this case, Biden, but before the president is willing to step in and outright federalize. And the degree to which adjutant generals are willing to play ball with that. So that to me, the National Guard has a very different problem set to think about because they have this kind of dual nature of civilian control that is inherent in the organization. But when you have things like contested elections and when US elections are so decentralized and given to the states, that gives governors an awful lot of power to subvert federal process, potentially. Again, I'm not saying that it will happen, but I'm saying that it is something that adjutant generals absolutely need to be cognizant of and be thinking about in advance, because you don't want, the last thing you want is to be the adjutant general of a state, have the governor come to you and say, by the way, we're seizing voting machines, and you haven't thought about this scenario before, and you've got to make it up on the fly. That's the last thing that you want. So thinking through kind of what does that look like, and what is my response going to be, and what is an illegal order in this particular, what do illegal orders look like? What are the consequences to the profession? What are the consequences to all of that? Those are game plans that I think military leaders need to take very seriously going up to the election.
Yeah, if I could just add to one thing we found a lot of, I feel like we found a lot of success on what we did was kind of to your earlier point, remind your service members about the oath of office, like just flat out. Like even if you have them recite it, even if you just have them read on it and reflect and tell you what they think about it, remind them about the oath of office. That's the first part. Second part is honestly like sticking as closely as possible to what is in DODs, what is in instruction, what is in policy, what are the bright red rules about this stuff will be the other piece to it, because it is so nebulous at times, it is so sticky, that it's going to be difficult for these commanders to have a lot of room for interpretation. I think the one thing, again, to Carrie's excellent point, that they should be aware of, and potentially will have to look for interpretation is illegal orders. And when that, if and when that individual in any type of position of authority over you comes to you and says, "Hey, we want you to do X thing," and that sounds wrong or potentially illegal to them, they need to have a plan. Is it to go to a general counsel, to a JAG officer, and have that conversation with them? Is it to engage subordinate leadership and seek out their counsel, and before they make a decision, have a plan? Because the last thing you want to do is be caught on your back heels without one. But that's, I think, the biggest part to this.
I would add that, it's not dissimilar to how we ask War College students to think about what are your ethical and moral red lines, in service that would cause you to resign your commission.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And it's not so different a conversation. Now, in most of the time, the safe space, this is to think about, what you would do while serving abroad, or being asked to make decisions about, whether to go to war or not, whether to commit troops into battle, et cetera. It's complicated, and it's less comfortable to think about when you're given, orders to do things domestically.
Yeah.
But it's not, this kind of thought exercise is not a new ask.
And I think that's the other thing we really need to highlight about it. This is not new territory. Like, the more that we treat this as a part of just the normal system of what leaders, officers, NCOs have to deal with, the better off I think we're going to be. And they're not going to be shocked whenever they have to potentially engage in this type of thought exercise. Sorry.
Okay, so a couple of things to add on to what you've both just said. One of the things that Carrie mentioned was the issue in Oklahoma of the vaccines. That has actually, the Oklahoma case has been resolved. The Texas case has not been resolved. And the Texas case is before the Fifth Circuit, which, if you know anything about circuits, you know about the Fifth Circuit. And the issue there is that case, so this is Abbott versus Biden and Austin and a couple of other defendants. The issue there is that Abbott wants to argue that the Constitution says that the president has no authority over the National Guard unless they are in federalized status, which, if it gets upheld, if that argument gets upheld by a court, it overturns more than, so at this point, 120 years of precedent, starting in 1903, right? This would be absolutely catastrophic for the readiness of the National Guard, for the cohesion of the National Guard, and particularly for the political use of the Guard by various governors for all kinds of things. Because as of right now, the organizational setup is that if you are a member of the National Guard of the state, you are also concurrently a member of the National Guard of the United States, right? You can be a member of the state guard and not be a member of the US National Guard. But you are technically a Federal Reserve component. And that means that you are, and you are also mostly funded by the federal government, and that's just in general. And if you, and that means that your personnel issues are under federal purview. This court case by Abbott would overturn all of that. And that would be a very, very significant difference, and would massively increase the authority of state governors over the National Guard, to the extent where the president would really have to, you wouldn't be able to fix this just by being like, okay, I'm gonna federalize you, because you can't keep them federalized all the time, right? Yeah. So this would require a whole new approach to the total force policy. Like, you wouldn't have a total force anymore if this happened. So that is something that I think we should absolutely be keeping an eye on. And again, as Carrie pointed out, elections in this country are run at the state level. Elections in this country are run by the states. And the National Guard has a long history of election security. That is one of their roles. Usually cybersecurity, right? But can also be physical security if there is violence anticipated. So again, like, this is a significant issue that needs to have an eye kept on it. So there's that. The issue with the oath and the Constitution, like, I agree with you both that it's a great thing to remind service members that they took an oath to the Constitution and not to a particular person. I don't have as much confidence as either of you in terms of how effective that is, for a couple of reasons. Number one, people disagree on what the Constitution means.
Yeah.
People disagree on what the Constitution tells us that we as a country should do. People disagree on what is and is not constitutional. And so just reminding people that they took an oath to uphold the Constitution might still leave them in a position where person A believes that they're supposed to do this action and person B believes they're supposed to do the exact opposite action. In other words, you have at least convinced them that they're not supposed to be beholden to a particular individual giving orders, but you haven't actually unified them on an idea of what they are supposed to do. So I think that's sort of problem number one. Problem number two is to go back to Peter Fever's, formulation of the problematique of civil-military relations as being how to get a military that is both powerful and competent enough to defend us from enemies, but self-restrained enough not to use that power against us, the society, right? You can formulate this in another way, which is, how do you get a military that is both savvy enough to know how to defend the Constitution and not use that savvy to manipulate the political system? You can also frame it as, how do you get a military that understands that it is not supposed to be, it's not supposed to hold allegiance either to a specific individual or to its own concept of what the nation should look like and how it should function, right? They're supposed to give their allegiance to the nation's understanding of the nation. But if the state and the nation are at odds with one another, or we don't know how to tell what the nation thinks, right, or who the nation even is, then you've got a problem. I'm a pessimist. I'm sorry. We're all going to drink after this.
Well, just one thing. The piece on the oath is the oath, and it can't be the oath by itself. That's yeah.
Yeah, it's an empirical question too, right? So graduate students out there, this is a great survey experiment to run actually on military officers. For those of you who have IRBs, to survey cadets and things like that. I'm not looking at you, Heidi, at all. That does a simple reminder of the oath, right, actually change behavior or not? That's a really interesting question and an empirical one.
There's a dissertation that does something similar by Trent Lithgow that actually finds that it's not the oath, but it's a reminder of norms. It finds that on military personnel, it makes a difference, not on civilians, but
Trent Lithgow. Okay.
he's at Leavenworth.
Trent Lithgow at Leavenworth. Go look up the dissertation. I'm certainly going to go look it up.
Easy Friday afternoon, evening. All right, reading.
Let me ask you a
Light,
follow-up.
very light.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up to this one. Are senior military leaders, National Guard leaders, are they better postured to think about these threats, this idea of pulling the military into election interference? Are they better postured in 2024 than they were in 2020? No change, or are things worse? And I'll start with the pessimist at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they must be in some sense more attuned to the fact that this might happen. I would think, exactly as Bishop said and as Carrie said, the last thing you want is to end up in a difficult ethical, legal situation and be like, it has never occurred to me that this might happen. You need to have thought through these things beforehand and at least have an idea of who you're going to ask for advice. I absolutely think that everyone is more aware now of the kinds of things that might happen than they were in 2020. Does that mean that there is an organizational response that has taken place to prepare them for it? I don't think so, no. And that would be much more difficult with the National Guard than it would be with the federal forces. So am I hopeful that individuals have spent more time thinking about it? Yes. Am I hopeful that the organization has given them any guidance or direction or instruction or policy on how to think about these things? Less so.
Bishop.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all of that. I hope, and I think that my two colleagues are better positioned to say what the senior military officials are learning in a classroom environment right now. I would think at this point, given the recent history, that yes, we are learning from that and understand of the complexities that we may see domestically that could have an impact on units, on unit cohesion, good order and discipline, and they have taken note. In terms of what the overall community, military community, and what organizations have actively done in terms of any type of potential orders, guidance on training and what to do if faced with these, that I don't know, and I am a little concerned generally.
I guess I get to be the pessimist here,
Excuse me.
because I think it's a wash. Yes, I think individuals are thinking more about it. I think they are better prepared to the degree that no one was prepared 4 years ago. But governors are also more prepared, and so we forget that governors have the appointment authority over adjutant generals. It's a political appointment. Mm-hmm. And so they can change out that appointment if you get the vibe that someone is not going to be sympathetic to how you want to use your guard. So I think it's a wash right now, that both the opportunities or the planning for misuse has had 4 years. If there is such planning for misuse, and I'm not asserting that there is actively, I have no knowledge of this going on, right? But if you were to be worried about the misuse of the National Guard, you've got a set of folks who have 4 years to put their adjutant generals into place. While also you have a crop of 1- and 2-star National Guard's service people who have been thinking about it. And so I guess this is maybe this kind of symptom of polarization where the folks who are prepared and concerned and see this as a problem are more prepared, and the folks who don't see this as a problem and see this as an opportunity to advance political objectives are also probably more prepared.
I'm going to curb my enthusiasm on continued questions for the panel, but I have several in reserve. And invite audience members to come to our microphones to pose questions to our colleagues here.
Hi, Colonel Jess Grassetti, current resident student here at the War College. And Lindsay, I'm really glad that you brought up the confidence statistics that you were using, I assume, for your research. As part of our Civ-Mil relations class, we looked at the 2023 Reagan National Defense Survey. Mm-hmm. And one of the only defining characteristic when they were looking at confidence in the military was actually age. And to the point where less than a third of those under 30 actually had confidence, great confidence in the military. So my question for all of you is, as we're looking at the recruiting issues and what will also become retention issues, I'm sure in the near future, how do we approach that? What are some things that we do to try to build up that confidence? And, because not as a pessimist, I don't think it's too late, but this is certainly going to continue to be an issue. So how do we combat this? And what are some things that you would recommend that we do in the future? Thanks.
I'll start since I was name called. I mean, I think that this, to a certain extent, was addressed in a previous panel where the upshot of the discussion was basically the military needs to do better at a bunch of things, and they need to improve their response to things like sexual assault and sexual harassment. They need to improve the experiences, particularly of Black women in the military, given that Black women serve disproportionately in the military, but they're also disproportionately likely to say that they would not encourage their young relatives to serve in the military. That is happening because they're not having a great time. At least I'm assuming that's why that's happening. So there are ways in which the military needs to, do better at some things. But to a certain extent, I think the youth,
The youngs.
I know. It was a long, long time ago. But there are lots of sort of larger level. So we can criticize the military for not doing as well as it should be doing on certain things, and I agree with that. There are also just larger structural reasons why younger people have less trust in the military than older people do. That is almost always true, for one thing. That's not just now that's a thing. And there are, there is less trust among young people in most of the institutions of society as well. The military is, now starting to suffer from the same thing. I think a lot of the young people in the sort of Gen Z, Gen Alpha categories just do not think that institutions are working well in general. And I mean, I'm not saying that explains everything, right? I think, she disappeared. There she is. The point is a very good one, right? But so my response would be the military can do better at some things, and also we just have to kind of suck it up.
Man, this question. So a part of this is two things, and we're having real talk here, so we're gonna talk through it. One, we're having a massive culture clash within the United States right now. When you look, and I think Lindsay just kind of spoke about this too. You look at the general population of African Americans within the United States. I think the last time I looked, you're roughly talking about 12 to 13% of the overall population. If in 2022, and I think this number is probably about the same, when you looked at the population of African Americans serving with the United States military, it was 1 in 5. It's 20%. And if you go through and look at each of the minority groups within the United States, per their population of the United States population versus their representation within the military, they're all higher like that. All of them are. So what's going on right now in society, and what are we doing? We're destroying and attacking DEI. Now, the issue is that DEI programs were, at least as they relate to the military, were designed based on that gap that I just talked about. When we know that we have minorities serving at an outsized proportion within the military versus their representation in society. And a part of that is because it's always been about upward mobility. My father was a Vietnam veteran, got a Bronze Star as a young gun bunny on 155s as part of First Cav. And that opportunity allowed him to go out and get a home for his family, and allowed him an education, and allowed him to work for the South Carolina Employment Security Commission for 32 years, helping other veterans get jobs. It was upward mobility. He grew up in a two-bedroom house with 7 other siblings in South Carolina. He would not have had the opportunities that he had it not been for the United States military. And the programs, when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, were targeted to help young people understand that reality, that they had opportunities of greater success both in the military and outside of it with military service. So when they now, today, see that those types of programs are being attacked, they're questioning, well, what exactly are the values of the United States military? What exactly is it about? And that is not to say that I think that DEI programs are the end all be all and they're perfect. They're not. Like, no program in any type of bureaucracy of this size is ever going to be perfect. Of course, there are going to be opportunities to shape it, opportunities to make it better, opportunities to take away from it. Okay, sure. But when you have the type of rhetoric that we have about these types of things right now, they're going to have a detrimental impact. They just are. The other part is, and as you go back and Lindsay was speaking about African-American women, particularly in the military, we have to admit one thing, that it is not a pure meritocracy. The United States military isn't. I'm sorry, it's not, and it never has been. When you talk about making it, and I know many of you know better than I do, they're sitting in this room, when you talk about making it to higher levels of leadership, when you talk about making it to the flag ranks, when you go before that board, if you have not already made the prerequisites, when you are a full bird colonel, if you have not already hit all of your prerequisites to make it to that one-star position, you're not going to even be looked. Your packet's going to go away. Well, did you understand all of that before you made it to full bird? How did you make it to full bird? What validators took you aside and put their name alongside yours? Who invested in your career at the exact stages that you needed in order for you to make it to those next stages? I have so many stories I've been told over the past few years in particular, in which it was a young lieutenant colonel or a young colonel who was plucked up, or someone saw something in him or her and brought them up through the ranks for them to make 3-star and 4-star. There is a 4-star general right now who is very senior in the United States Army, who was identified back when he was a cadet at West Point as someone that might be talented. And he was watched throughout his career. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't. Of course he was talented. Of course he was superior in a lot of things he was doing. Who's doing that for young black women? Who's doing that for young Latino men, Latino women? Is that happening? Because I'm not sure that it is. And that's a part of it. Now, I'll say that I think if it is happening, it's happening more so now today than it definitely was happening 20, 30, 40 odd years ago. But we have to admit to ourselves that this is a part of the issue.
So the two things that I'll add, first is that if you're interested in public trust in the military and what affects public trust in the military, there's a great new book out that you should go read. The second thing that I would add, though, is, and it's informed by the Reagan Defense Poll, and what I take from the Reagan Defense Poll, which is, I'm a little bit of a cynic about that particular survey.
Yeah.
But I think it shows something interesting, which is that when primed to answer a certain way, people do. And so if you want to improve public trust in the military, or if you want to improve public trust in institutions, the civilians can improve public trust in the military and the institutions. They can stop politicizing the military. They can stop, to use a phrase that I hope Peter uses at dinner, but I'm gonna steal his thunder a little bit. If they were to declare the military non-combatants in the culture war, right, then public trust in the military as an institution would rise. And it would cease to put military officers and uniformed folks and civil servants in the DoD as well, by the way, in these very uncomfortable positions, what I have started to call kind of the politicization trap, of let me ask you about an issue and let us discuss an issue that is essential to readiness, that is essential to effectiveness, to tactics, operations, et cetera, and let's make it a partisan and let's politicize it, so that military officers are afraid to speak about anything. And so that's the civilians have a very important role here in contributing to this decline, that military officers can only do so much because they're caught between these two things.
One more thing I wanted to add. This is a point. It goes back still to talking about when we talk about demographics and how things look. one thing that society has done that has served, that has placed us at a great disservice, I think, overall, is when we stopped generally looking at people from rural communities as also being, having less opportunity and being disenfranchised. And I say this for the focus is often much about African Americans, about Latinos, about women, about LGBTQ. I will tell you that having grown up in Deep South in a semi-rural area, poor is poor, and it doesn't care what color you are, and it doesn't allow for you to have some of the same opportunities, and that is continuously having an impact. And we need to really understand and appreciate that too, because there are a lot of young, able-bodied white men who have not had the opportunities that a lot of their counterparts have because of where they grew up and because of the background that they have. And they see a lot of this dialogue around people of color, around women and others, and they do, I think, to some degree, rightfully go, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't have these opportunities either. So I think it is important for us to recognize that in a lot of the demographic discussions as well as we continue to talk about these recruitment and retention gaps, because I think all of it, for better or worse, plays into the policies and the dialogue.
No, that's a really good point. You know, you mentioned, you told the story of your father. My mother's is a very similar story, right? She grew up in rural Tennessee, joined the Air Force, Air Force ROTC when she was 16 years old out of high school, and was in the second class, got a chance to be in the second class of women to learn how to fly planes. Very cool things that you get to do from rural Tennessee that she would have never had the opportunity to do otherwise.
Okay, let's go to our next question. Yes, sir, please.
Yes. So before I ask the question, Carrie, thank you very much for putting these conversations together, and especially for situating this panel before the happy hour, because as Lindsay said, we will need a drink after this. My name is Amit Ahuja. I'm here all the way from UC Santa Barbara. I have two questions. One, we spoke about extremism and how the number of people who may be impacted or who are affected, or that number is very small. And we spoke about the military, we spoke about the National Guard. There's a fair number of veterans who are heading into the militia. There's also a fair number who head into the police forces. The culture in the police forces is something which has been a cause of worry. So as we think about potential for violence in the times ahead, are we thinking about the role of the police forces, and especially, how some of those people who may hold extremist views and are serving in the police force and are violence specialists, how they are likely to act? That's one. Second, having done interviews with people who did not obey their oath in a moment of crisis and, essentially broke discipline. The one story that emerges is not that they were not aware of their oath. It's that they wanted the other side of their oath to also be held, that part of that contract to be honored, which is they were trained to be sent into harm's way with the assurance that their family, their community will be looked after and they will be safe. The problem in internal conflict is that those families, those communities are they are under threat. And once those values, those communities are under threat, then these individuals reconsider their oath. So when we imagine that scenario, whether it's in tabletop exercises or conversations, are we thinking of that aspect of the threat felt by soldiers?
I can answer part of the first one.
Sure, go for it.
That's just because, thank you for those questions. They're both excellent. And to your first one about veterans, and particularly about law enforcement, as a part of our work, we actually did speak and work with both DHS from the federal law enforcement perspective, as they were also speaking to state and local law, as well as Veterans Affairs. And again, it continues to be a politically nebulous, difficult discussion because of the way a lot of these issues have been politicized. But that said, I will say that from a veteran community perspective, because the vast majority of the individuals that we see from data that are engaging in this type of extremist activity that have connections back to military service are veterans. It's not active duty, and it is some, you do see a few reservists and some National Guard, but more often than not, it's people that have already separated from military service. So from a veteran's perspective, the gap is that for us, the military, or for us, at the time for us, the military looks at UCMJ and avenues for discipline, whereas Veterans Affairs, we're looking for avenues of an additional benefit, meaning how can we show these veterans that there are other opportunities and other ways to deal with this frustration, or maybe this feeling of a lack of community, or this void of leadership, where the veteran came from a very structured, rigorous environment in the military to transitioning to civilian life, and that same structure isn't there. How do we close that gap and seal off that leadership vacuum without them searching it out in areas like militias or other types of groups that may have similar types of ideologies? So that's the internal government struggle first in dealing with it. At least on the veteran side, there are more NGOs and more civil society groups that are popping up, as I'm sure you know, that are trying to help the veteran community understand the issue and deal with it in healthy ways, whether that's providing their own new sense of community, going out and hiking, or some type of liked activity, shared activity that can help create a healthier environment, or whether it's getting them active in civics in a way that is, again, nonpartisan, just going and helping to support at local polling stations and that type of stuff. So there are a lot of things that are happening on the veteran side that I actually am pretty supportive of. And then quickly on the DHS side, just kind of as you laid out, they recognize this an issue. They're continuing to try to find new ways and new pathways of vetting people, of trying to everything from questionnaires to interviews to doing background checks themselves, understanding, well, oh, you separate from military. Why did you separate from military? Is that information available? Like what actually happened? And just getting to understand it in a similar way that we do the adjudicative process within the military too, whenever you're bringing someone into the service.
So yeah, I'll just add to. So Amit, I may not do justice to your second question, but when you ask about how, are we taking account of the feeling of threat to their own communities that soldiers and other service members who might be deployed domestically might feel, I would say yes. So the military leadership is pretty acutely aware of how much troops dislike these missions. And one of the main reasons that troops dislike these missions is precisely the community ties. I've had students who were National Guard or reservists who were deployed to deal with the Ferguson protests, deployed to deal with some of the other protests that involved a real clash for those individuals of their personal feelings, of their personal beliefs in who constituted the real threat. And the military leadership is aware of this, but it's a very sticky problem. But I will point out, the military leadership doesn't like these domestic deployment missions at all, and they try to avoid them if possible. But it's a great question. Just to add a little teeny bit to what Bishop said about veterans and police forces, I think we know from research on this, both in the context of police forces, a little bit on militias, but also in terms of some other research, that there are sort of two directions that veterans who join police forces tend to go. The ones who join militias all tend to be on sort of one side of this. The ones who join police forces tend to be of two different groups. One is the group that misses having the authority to apply violence and force. And They like that position, and this is an issue with police recruiting in general, right? There are basically two types of people who are easy to recruit to police forces. One is the type that wants to serve their community and do something good and be of service and protect people. The other is the kind that likes to throw their authority around and be able to tell people what to do and be allowed to use violence if they're not obeyed. That is true with veterans as well. And so the second group of veterans is the kind who want to continue to serve, right? They leave the service and they want to continue to serve their community. And those veterans frequently bring a level of professionalism and restraint to the police departments that they join. But so you've got two distinct groups, I think, and there's really, I don't think there's any research, at least not that I'm aware of, on the frequency or concentration of these things.
Yeah, I'll add two things. I know I'm super mindful of time, very, very fast. The first is like, we don't know, right? We talk about veterans and extremism. We don't have data on the degree to which veterans display extremist sympathies. This is not data that is available. There are some really terrible studies out there. Don't pay attention to them. But we have yet to have like really good systematic work that evaluates the degree to which veterans in American society are more or less susceptible to support for political violence and extremist beliefs. On coming back disillusioned, I would actually argue, and we can talk about this more at the happy hour, that this is a problem not for society, this is a problem for the profession. That the profession of arms is somewhat unique across other professions because in exchange for giving up a significant amount of rights, you are giving up these rights because there is a contract with the profession that they are going to take care of you, that you're going to be told where to go, how to wear your hair, and potentially give up your life, right, et cetera, et cetera. And the implicit contract is that the profession will take care of you and it's going to look out for you. And so you see that coming back disillusioned, not just with families, but this is the sexual assault problem. These are all of these kind of harmful behaviors, and that's a problem for the profession.
Okay, we are out of time. I'm going to collect these two questions. There's been a demonstrated interest in happy hour, so we're not going to go through this too. But please, we'll start with Risa, and then you give us our questions. And I would ask for the most succinct answers of your lifetimes.
30 seconds
by our
or
panels.
less.
Risa, go.
Okay. So listening to all of you talk today, one of the things that I've sort of come around to is how corrosive the lack of actual concrete data about extremism in the military actually is. And this speaks to Carrie's point. And I'm wondering, I understand the political problems. I remember years ago when Janet Napolitano, when she was head of DHS and tried to there was some really short report about veterans being recruited, and she had to dismantle the whole unit in DHS because it was such a political firestorm about that. But I also sort of think like, when I think about the tropes of the students in my class and the attachment to the idea that everybody's an extremist, if we actually knew, maybe we could actually challenge that or actually get a hold of the problem. But the issues of measurement are huge, Carrie, and I just was curious if anyone had any thoughts about these. That IDA report, terrible methodology, right? I don't know what DOD was thinking contracting with those folks, because what they do to measure extremism is they look at, well, who's doing what manifest behavior do we see? And we know from that's not a way to really assess the potential of a problem, is by looking what people are doing today. And I'm thinking about, and then I'll try to be quick, two things just to throw out there. One is the literature we know about from terrorism in a very different context, which is we don't fully understand the relationship between radicalization in beliefs and actual behavior. Okay. And if we could learn from that what they know, I don't know if they know anything more than they used to know, but that's a complicated dynamic. But then second, the idea of looking for behaviors as, needing a really other good measurement for that. And that, what I'm thinking about there is this scholarship in a very different context on preference falsification. And what it looks at is in authoritarian regimes, if you go ask a bunch of people, they all say they're perfectly fine with the regime. And then there's a massive protest and the threshold, the dam breaks. And you finally get to see what everyone really thinks. So figuring out how to measure and seeing if we had a big domestic crisis, a big polarizing event, what really would happen, figuring out how to think about that problem seems really important. And as politically explosive as it is, I don't see that it can get much worse. So maybe we should just try to really figure it out in a good, as well as we can. It's not really a question, sort of commenty, sorry.
Thank you, Risa. Go.
Okay, so, William Howell, Texas Tech University. So my main research area is veteran identity and veteran reintegration. So I apologize if my study is one of the bad studies you should not read, but I have published some studies in this area.
I'm talking about the RAND report and the IDA report.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I actually developed a scale to help, called the Veteran Contempt for Civilian Communication Scale, to help measure things before they happen with veterans. So in Bravo 3, you can hear about it tomorrow. So shameless plug for that. But then also, so what I wanted to mention is a lot of information has been talked about from an officer point of view. But obviously we know most of the military is enlisted personnel. And a lot of times enlisted personnel are the ones that we see, at least just my personal anecdotes, my friends that I've seen, and I've run political tests and we find no significance. We actually find veterans being more moderate than civilian counterparts, but civilians being more extreme. So what we have seen though is those people that desire structure, I was mentioned earlier, are the ones that often end up going down a more radical path. Yeah. The other thing we see is that veteran identity or military identity is no longer being satiated, so they have to find some way to satiate that, and they can do it by joining one of these more militaristic groups. And whether it's just an extreme ideology or it's actually acting as domestic terrorists, they enact their military identity and relive the good old days in this way. So we can sort of predict it, and we have done some studies that show some predictive patterns for this. And so I'm wondering, though, from y'all, and it was brought up at the beginning, what responsibility should the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army, for me as an Army medic, E4 when I went to Iraq, right, take when I get out of the military? It took 8 to 10 weeks to transform me into a veteran, into a military member, change my identity, and then I have 24 hours of exit training, and then I'm supposed to be able to survive in the civilian world, right? So what in that reentry process, and then again, it makes the military look bad if I go out and do something as a veteran. So how responsible do you think the DoD should be in helping veterans reintegrate in an appropriate way, maybe even in the amount of time it took to train them in basic training?
Great. Thank you. We'll go down the line. We'll start with Lindsay. About 30 seconds each to hit either or both. The question of measurement challenges in defining and tracking extremism, and DoD's responsibility in reintegration into society.
Yeah, so excellent points both. I think to Risa's point, we have a ton of research on these issues in countries other than the United States. We just feel icky about applying it to the United States, right? But we know a lot about violent extremism. We don't know a lot about the relationship between radicalization and behavior, but this comes to your point, which is that we know that group belonging and identity are significantly more important in the process of radicalization than your actual beliefs about stuff, right? You pick up the beliefs about stuff because you want to belong somewhere, and if there's a group available, that's where you go, right? And so to answer your question, or I don't have an answer, but I think the DoD has a significant responsibility to help people reintegrate into society in ways like what Bishop was talking about, so I'll let him talk about those ways, but great.
Yeah, I think both of these issues really play into one another. One issue when you talk about the data and we talk about some of the things that we've seen, I know DoD is trying to make efforts to tag and categorize data better. So we're not just getting like, oh, well, why were they separated from the military? It was for a domestic issue X versus, oh, that included extremist behavior, extremist activity, because commanders are going to go with the lowest common denominator, whatever the easiest thing is to get them out. Maybe it's
harder to go ahead and label it as, extremist, as something along those lines. So that's one thing. But also, too, and this is something we've had conversations with the FBI about, you're seeing more and more that the idea of the lone wolf is kind of a misnomer in and of itself. They're acting on a la carte ideology, meaning that they may take today something that's a misogyny and something else is racism or something else is here and there, and it makes for strange bedfellows because you have some people who you would think, hate each other. Well, they hate this group on that particular issue. So it's making the data piece of this a little more difficult, but we have to find a way forward. In terms of transition, I do think that DoD has a responsibility for transition programs. I think they're trying to find more robust ways of doing it. We improved questionnaires and information about potential targeting by groups based on your experiences and based on the fact that you are transitioning out and your skill set, that you're going to be targeted by some groups in order for them to take advantage of that stuff. But we've got to do more, and we have to find a more systematic way of what that is that we can do. What is the practical in that transition period? Because it also goes into age. How old are some of these people? The young E4, as they're getting out, may be a bit more susceptible to some of the type of rhetoric out there than the E6 or the E7 or the.
My quick answer is, Risa, yes. It's corrosive. It allows the space to fill with all kinds of narratives and all kinds of, people tell the story that they want to tell, and we have nothing to combat it with. So yes, more measurement, more data on this is absolutely necessary to make any progress whatsoever, even if it is to find that veterans are actually more moderate. On the responsibilities of DoD, I think the most powerful argument to me for the DoD accepting some responsibility and more responsibility than they have, and they have made progress on this, by the way. Veterans transition programs are much more robust today, much more fully integrated with the DoD than they were even 10 years ago. And so, the DoD has, to its credit, tackled this and is working hand in hand with the VA in a lot of ways to try and ease the transition and make transition easier for veterans, all the way from year E4 all the to
warrior life cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the most powerful argument for an increased role and for why DoD should continue this trend is a line in the introduction of Kathleen Bellu's book, Bringing the War Home, where she reports that the best recruiting cycle for the Ku Klux Klan is in the aftermath of every war that the United States has fought. As you have veterans that are transitioning, coming back from fighting abroad, that the Ku Klux Klan has a recruiting field day because of this lack of sense of belonging and need to join. It's not that everyone we send abroad are white supremacists, right, to this point. It's that you discover a sense of community and camaraderie in that, and you come back and you need something. And extremist organizations really feed off of that. And so that to me is the strongest argument for why DoD should take a lot of responsibility to make sure that we are transitioning veterans so that they are aiding society rather than seeking to undermine it.
On that happy note, the happy hour is upon us. So please join me in thanking my panelists.